And now we will take a look at a couple of units of measures to understand the impact of carbs on blood glucose level. So the first one is glycemic index. It measures the rate or speed at which the carbs are absorbed in the blood. So the benchmark or reference point is consuming 50 grams of glucose against 50 grams of any carbohydrate that you want to measure the glycemic index of. So the GI value or the glycemic index for after consuming 50 grams of glucose is considered to be 100, and all other carbohydrates are then compared against this value of 100. So the GI is divided into three categories. Less than 55 is a low GI, between 55 and 70 is a medium GI, and 70 onwards is really high or very high GI. So this helps in understanding what happens when we consume, let's say, a wheat roti versus a lachha paratha, a pineapple versus, let's say, a bunch of berries like raspberries or strawberries, blackberries and things like that, and let's say a couple of oranges versus a glass full of orange juice. Since the GI value of all these foods that I've just mentioned is different, the impact on blood glucose after consuming these foods is going to be very different or drastically different. So before I get into that interesting topic and subject, I would like to cover the second unit of measure, which is glycemic load. So while glycemic index covers the rate or speed of absorption, the glycemic load also covers the quantity of food that is being consumed. So again, the same example, if I consume, let's say, one wheat roti versus 3 or 4 wheat rotis, or let's say a couple of oranges versus let's say 5 or 7 oranges. So that particular aspect is getting covered over here in the glycemic load. So the GL or the glycemic load is a measure of the rate at which the carbs are consumed into the quantity of same carbs which is consumed, and it is measured on the scale of 1 to 20. Less than or equal to 10 is basically a low GL food. Between 11 and 19 is considered to be a medium GL, and anything greater than 20 is considered to be a very high GL. So let's come to the most interesting aspect of our discussion today. So what decides a glycemic index? So any carb food item which has, let's say, a good amount of fibers, fats and proteins along with the usual starch and carbohydrate is essentially having a lower glycemic index, and because of that it takes a longer time to get digested. Against when, let's say, a food item only has more of starch and carbohydrates and very less or no fibers, fat, proteins, then obviously the glycemic index for that particular food item is too much on the higher side, and it is not very safe to consume. And the most interesting caveat to this is, let's take an example of a small size wheat roti which sits on the lower side of the glycemic index scale, which is considered to be a low glycemic index food. But what happens when a person consumes not just one, but let's say 3 or 4 same sized wheat rotis? The glycemic load becomes too much on the higher side. It is not considered to be as safe as eating one small size roti. So that's the caveat, that's the kind of misconception which is very prevalent amongst the people, and which is essentially leading us to a lot of metabolic disorders. So in addition to the amount of carbs, the GI and GL of those carbs, another important factor which decides when and if a person would become insulin resistant is the frequency at which the person consumes those carbs. And when the insulin is secreted more number of times, the levels of insulin stay elevated for a longer duration, and that essentially will again lead to the phenomenon of someone becoming insulin resistant. And in this situation, the excess glucose would get converted to fat through insulin, making the person either overweight or obese, and then leading to subsequent disorders. So the key reasons for aspects like obesity, like diabetes, like blood pressure, triglyceride, all of that is not consuming fat, but it is to do with consuming more amount of carbs, more amount of high GI food, and more amount of high GL food. So please ensure that when you are consuming food, you are eating right and you are balancing your carbs in a very appropriate way, or at times probably just avoiding those. So in the next session, we'll take a stab at the most common foods and the glycemic index and glycemic load that these foods create. So stay tuned. Thank you.